Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Policy Forum today on Sudan's civil war. It's good to have you with us. Thanks for joining. This week marked the grim 100-day milestone of the war in Sudan. In this relatively short period, the war has affected so many. Nearly 3,000 have been killed, 3 million displaced, 750,000 refugees have fled to neighboring countries. We've seen disturbing reports of atrocities, including sexual violence and the conscription of child soldiers. So far, there have been a series of broken ceasefires, a series of mediations, processes led by the African Union, Cairo, Jeddah, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, or IGAD. We've also seen Western sanctions in response, US, British, and soon-to-be European Union measures targeting supporters of the warring parties, Burhan's Sudanese army and Hemedti's rapid support force. The conflict is likewise drawn in a series of regional and Middle Eastern actors, including Iran, Libya, Chad, Eritrea, Kenya, United Arab Emirates, and reportedly Russia's Wagner forces, among others. Meanwhile, on the ground, fighting continues, and the mediators in the UN appear to be at a loss for civilian partners with whom to engage. Sudan's transition Prime Minister, Abdel Fattah, is currently encamped in the UAE. There's a lot to discuss, and I'm pleased that the Washington Institute is hosting this policy forum today. And we've got a great panel. Joining us are Reem Abbas. She's a writer, researcher, civil society activist, and blogger who has worked with the U.S. Institute of Peace, Freedom House, International Crisis Group, and the UN. She's a widely published author, and her book, Undoing Resistance, Authoritarianism, and Attacks on the Arts in Sudan's 30 Years of Islamic Rule, was published in February 2023, I believe. We have Yasir Zaidan, who is a lecturer in international affairs at National University in Sudan and a doctoral candidate at the University of Washington. He's also proudly a former research assistant at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. His excellent article, Hemedti's Rise in Sudan is a Threat to Regional Stability, appeared in Foreign Policy Online in April 23. And we have Alex Rondos, a senior advisor with the Africa Center at U.S. Institute for Peace. He formerly served as the European Union Special Representative for the Horn of Africa. Ambassador Rondos writes extensively on Sudan, among other topics, and I would encourage you to look at his prescient piece from May 2023, What Sudan Needs Right Now at usip.org. Just a piece of bookkeeping before we start with the panelists. After they are finished, I will ask a few questions and we'll have a question and answer session. You can send in your questions if you're on Zoom via the Q&A function on the application, or if you're watching via YouTube, you can send in via email a question to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org, and I will see that in my chats. So with that, I'll turn it over to Yasir Zaidan. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm really happy to be back here virtually at the Institute. I will start my remarks on just outlining what's the play of the ground, or the state of the play in the ground today in Sudan. After 2 months or more of the war, which was basically an attempt by the RSF leader Hemedti to take power and to rule the country, we have seen now more of the Sudanese armed forces taking the initiative and taking offensive in several areas in Khartoum. However, the war has become more uglier than before. There is the RSF has committed genocidal campaign in Darfur, seen in Jenaina, Western Darfur, and Khartoum. and where we saw the murder of the Western Darfur governor, Mr. Khamis Abubakar. Also, we are seeing now there is RSF is using drones to attack civilians in Khartoum and other places. So the civilian casualties are on the rise. Also, the humanitarian situation is deteriorating because of the international aid is diminishing, and we've seen now also the famine disaster is being very much expected because of the disrupt of the harvesting season, and also the limited access to fertilizers and seeds. So there is a humanitarian problem as well. There's only like a handful of international aid agencies that are now working in Khartoum. We have seen, as you, David, as you mentioned, there was some mediation efforts. The Jeddah talks, of course, sponsored by the US and KSA, attempted to reach a ceasefire several times, but these ceasefires were broken and they failed to reach a long-lasting ceasefire. One of the problems with these ceasefires is that actually they have been broken, but also it gave the RSF soldiers an opportunity to get into civilian houses, attack hospitals, and turn them into barracks. So basically the fighting is stopped between the two armies, but then the civilians would actually be the target. Also, there has been some regional initiatives. Different regional players tried to intervene. However, some of those players or initiatives were not balanced and thoughtful. As example, as just like Kenya and Ethiopia called for intervention by the East African forces, which I think was it was a very disastrous idea, just to, or a policy to do or to solve the problem in Sudan. Egypt as well convened the meeting of neighboring countries this month, and they also convened the political actors as well. So we've seen a fragmentation of mediation, which is also not helping to solve the problem. I think it will make it more complex. For the US, I think the US kind of policy toward what's happening in Sudan was to, of course, for the warriors to reach like a ceasefire and then go back to what was called the framework agreement or the framework plan to bring about or like to restart the civilian transition, which is also, this is the UNITAM's, United Nations Mission to Sudan framework that was being on the process before April 15, before the war started. However, that plan is no longer achievable because of the fragmentation inside the civilian camp, and also because of the war that is happening. I think with the RSF now and clashes with the SAF, it's very hard to have to go backwards. And of course, the framework agreement actually, in some way, actually led to the war by pointing out the integration of the RSF militia into the Sudanese armed forces. So the US policy also, I think, has been also very kind of disengaged only on ceasefire talks, but does not include all the full image of what's happening in Sudan. And of course, there is a regional stability problem. I think a collapsed state in Sudan threatens regional stability in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel region. We see now that Niger is now facing a coup d'etat, which could also just make the day more complex for international players. And that would actually threaten the US security interest in Africa directly, especially with the growing of, with the development of terrorist organization and also human trafficking that is very active in this region. So I think for one point is just we need to support the remaining state institution, and we need to actually drive a plan that could return Sudan back to post-war democratic transition. One of the things that the US has also used or utilized is sanctions, again, is SAF and RSF companies. However, sanctions has been studied and they were not successful most of the time because they need to be coupled with more with the full kind of tools of diplomatic statecraft and other kind of statecraft. They need to engage regional countries. They need to engage regional backers as well. And there is a need also to prevent Sudan to develop into a proxy war, just like what happened in Yemen. This is a gist of what I think about the situation now in Sudan and the US role that could be played. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Yasir. A lot to talk about. I have a lot of questions that I'll get to later for you to flesh out some of the issues that you raised. Reem?
Thank you, David. And I think, Yasir, you brought up a lot of important points. I want to start with something you said about this was basically an attempt by the RSF to take over the state. What happened on the 15th of April is a coup gone wrong, basically. And I think let's conceptualize it this way. It was an attempted coup by the RSF to take over the state. And I want to explain why I've come to this theory, because I see that a lot of people in the international community keep going back to that date and saying what really happened, who fired the first bullet. We still don't know, but I think we have different evidence in front of us that can help us form a theory. So this is my theory. I want to start by saying that we saw the war coming. So war was going to happen, and I saw it coming since 2019. But then it was very much going to come after the 2021 failed coup as well. By 2023, a few months before the coup, and actually a few weeks, before the coup and the war broke out, it was going to happen. We had a country with two armies. This is a recipe for disaster. This is a risk of conflict. So in the days before the failed coup and the war happened between the National Army and the Rapid Support Forces, which is a paramilitary force, of course, that was formed by the former President al-Bashir, not by the army, to combat the rebellions in different parts of the country. We saw an RSF force going to Medawi in northern Sudan. So they went to the largest, I would say, or one of the largest military airports, and force went and stationed itself outside the military airport, where a lot of the fighter jets are based. And then at the same time, we saw that the framework agreement, which was mediated by the international community, was really unraveling. So it was very clear that it was not going to be signed. It was clear that the army had a strong viewpoint against it because it gave the RSF ample time to integrate into the National Army. So giving it this ample time means that you're already creating a state within a state. But the problem was that the framework agreement treated the RSF as a separate force. And it is not, and I'm not really blaming the international community here and what they did in 2023. But let's go back to the constitutional declaration in 2019 that actually brought the government of former Prime Minister Hamdan to power. This constitutional declaration was also the source of the problem because it legitimized the RSF as a separate force. This is really where the big problem started. Okay, so the army felt threatened by the framework agreement, and Hemedti, let's say he needed to get to power at all costs. So the war broke out because the coup failed. It didn't go. It was supposed to end in just a few hours because Hemedti was deeply embedded in the state. He had a lot of the army generals were already working for him or working on his side. His force was big. They were everywhere. They had camps all over the country. But then a lot of things happened that just basically led to the failure of this coup, and then the war broke out, or it became a confrontation in different fronts in the country, and then of course a war. So there are different sides to the story, like I said, but I'm noting that the RSF has been mobilizing forces since in the weeks before the coup. So so there are many indications that they started the war, or perhaps fired the bullet that started this war. So what is happening right now? So this is perhaps the strangest contemporary war, because it's really total devastation of infrastructure. And it's also one of the greatest plunders, when it comes to the cultural and the human infrastructure of the country and the physical infrastructure. It is a war against civilians. So not only are civilians killed, but our houses have been looted and occupied. Right now, the RSF are in my house, for example, and many families and friends of mine, there have been staying in their houses for weeks now. They've driving our car, wearing our clothes, took away furniture in trucks, took away our furniture in trucks. So basically, they have really looted the population in Khartoum at a great cost. So we have been erased from the city, it is as if we've never existed beforehand. So this war is perhaps the largest demographic replacement in contemporary history, because you're forcing people out of their houses, and then you are occupying their houses, and sometimes they even bring their family members to live with them. So I want to go and talk about civil society, or talk about the divisions within civil society, because right now, we have a war, people are dying, it's a terrible humanitarian situation. There's ethnic cleansing happening in Western Sudan. The RSF is controlling parts of the country and parts of the capital. The SAF is controlling parts of the country, parts of the capital. It's almost like, two armies and two states in one state. But why is there a delay when it comes to reaching an agreement, or why are the peace talks not happening yet? I would say that it is very difficult for people to support the army, okay? And I'm saying this with all honesty, because it has held onto power and resources for so long, and it has been implicated in crimes beforehand. But then right now, this divide is so deep that it's turning into a situation where the whole country could disintegrate, basically. So on one side, you have an army that is right now, regardless of what it used to do before, it is trying to stop a complete takeover of the state from the side of the RSF, which is a militia that was intent on forming a dynasty. I mean, it's either Hemedti, they call him the prince, basically. So, and this militia is saying that it wants to bring democracy and fight the Islamists. Let's not forget that it is one of the legacies of the Islamists in Sudan. It has a social base that has benefited from the resources of the RSF. It's one of the largest employers of the country. So this is not an easy thing to do, because it's really deeply infiltrated in the society. And it also has like a tribal or ethnic base in different parts of Sudan. So it does have support. So you have this dichotomy that is happening, and it's deeply dividing people and deeply dividing the civil society. One of the critical issues here is that and this is really my opinion, the Freedom and Change Coalition, which is the largest famous, coalition that we all know, and the one that came to power during the rule of Hamdok, it's close to the RSF. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm not going to call it its direct political wing, but it's close enough. And it was its partner in the framework agreement. It's close enough that right now, this is making the only political coalition lose legitimacy. And this is a problem, right? Because you have a war and you need a way to bring back civilian politics. But how can you do that when the only political coalition was close to the militia that is now occupying our houses and that is killing us and raping women and so on? So they have only condemned the RSF literally 2 days ago, basically. And this is really too late for us as Sudanese people. So like I said, civil society has been divided by this war, because one side is supporting the army, the other side some people are supporting the RSF, mainly the political parties. And there are worries, because people are worried that if you do support the army and give it some kind of legitimacy, it's going to turn the country into a military dictatorship for good. And this is a worry, because in any conflict, you do have the potential of civil, non-violent politics becoming irrelevant, right? But the only way out here is to form a new political alliance that is accepted by the public, that doesn't have this baggage of like supporting the RSF and being implicated in shady business, and that can pave a new road for a post-war situation where the military is not the only party in control, because this is not what we want to see. We want the country to go back to a democratic, transformation path, basically. Yeah, sorry for saying a lot of things at once.
Reem, that's a very interesting perspective, and I appreciate it. Thank you for that. Ambassador, what does this all mean? What are the policy implications? Where do we go from here?
Thank you, and a good day to you all. That's not an easy one to answer. Let me first of all thank the two who've just spoken. I think both stated the issues very eloquently. Here's what I sense is occurring. First of all, on the ground, you've had a good description, but what I see is in this vast territory and a very diverse population, a fragmentation is underway. And it's a cascade of fragmentation. It's not just regions separating, it is within groups, within institutions. Is the military quite as united as it is? Who constitutes its constituency? Hemedti and the RSF are a very particular group. I mean, as someone who's had to spend some time dealing with Somalia, I see a warlord on the rise, as it were, with many of the attributes of warlordism. But he's brought the fight to the capital, which again, to use the Somali analogy, I mean, when this started by April the 16th, 17th, when I saw what was happening, I was calling up some friends and saying, doesn't this have a whiff of Mogadishu in the early 90s? It's that collapse, and what Reem, you just referred to, this idea that an historic city and its history is being sort of erased, include its very inhabitants are being erased. Is this just a collateral damage, or is it deliberate? I have a feeling I'd leave my options open on that, including the latter one. Now, if we've got that, then there's a fundamental policy question we have to ask, is what is it that has occurred that is now irreversible since April the 15th? What was underway before then that was either by design or default actually becoming an irreversible trend? So policy issue one is, let's be very careful about a lazy approach that says, well, let's see if we can restore a status quo ante. Which status quo? Of April the 1st, 2023, 2021, 2019. We can go back to the 60s even at that rate. So I think some very clear thinking is needed here. Two, I want to look a bit beyond Sudan, because there are implications that I find really alarming. The news of the coup attempt, and I don't know what's really unfolded in Niger today, is just symptomatic of something much wider that's occurring. And I think the emergence of the RSF, in effect, brings the Sahel into Sudan. But it goes further. The crisis of Sudan now has reached the Red Sea. Therefore, you've got two absolutely fundamental critical waterways that are at risk: the Nile and the Red Sea. The Nile, on which Sudan should be able to one day draw its wealth and the like, as well as being a supplier to many countries, not least Egypt, of course, and the Red Sea. One doesn't need to go into great detail on that, but if you're Egypt, you're Saudi Arabia, countries which have a vast and growing dependence on the Red Sea and the peace in and around the Red Sea, and huge investments related to that, something is at risk, because Sudan now, even if the eastern Sudan is comparatively stable, but only comparatively, and we don't know how long, we've got another conflict on the Red Sea, and certainly a grave uncertainty. Now, in addition to that, I would be extremely worried, and I'd like to hear others comment on this, Sudan is, people use this phrase loosely, there are ungoverned spaces. I don't buy that. Every inch of territory is governed by someone, whether it is organized crime, whether it is a tribe, whether it's a group or something else. That's the issue that we need to address. Therefore, who in this crisis of Sudan, who among the proliferating interests, weaponized interests, militias and otherwise, are beginning to occupy a role anticipating the day that there may be talks? So when I don't believe we're going to end up with solution between two belligerents. My worry is that the longer the time goes on, where there isn't, if I may put it bluntly, an imposition of a framework for people to talk, we're going to have a proliferation of people demanding a seat at that table. Then that raises an even bigger question. I think, Yasir, you said something which I want to elaborate on. You referred to the United States being disengaged. I'd like to unpack that a bit. Sitting where I do, I live in Nairobi and I'm involved very much in the regional affairs. This appearance of disengagement, I think, has had a profound effect, because this is a region where historically one has always assumed that the diplomatic 7th Cavalry would turn up under instructions from the 7th floor of the State Department or the White House. This does not appear to have occurred in a way that is both conspicuous, decisive. I don't have the answers to why that is, but those two attributes have not been particularly apparent. If that's the case, my question is not so much why, but what are the implications? It means that there's a region which is trying to come together, or a region which is affected by a conflict, which, as we say, is fragmenting and could easily spread in its impact, around which there's no framework of a political process. The multilateral institutions are not addressing this. The United Nations has not had a direct impact on it, nor seems to have been able to. The African Union has been pretty coy in its approach. The regional organization, which represents just a few of the neighbors, which is IGAD, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Sudan, is only one wing of what surrounds Sudan. And so I think what we've had is an absence of something that just immediately serves as a catalyst to bring everyone around. Normally in a situation like this, and again, it's a question I have, this initiative that's occurring in Jeddah, I am a little surprised. Had I been in my position where I was before, my immediate reaction would have been to call up Washington and say, for heaven's sake, if the United States and Saudi Arabia, the two most influential players, frankly, that surround this Sudan or are involved with it, are going to get involved, then the first thing you do is demand that everyone who's a neighbor immediately gathers, so that you begin to contain and insulate this problem, prevent interference in, but also minimize the spillover out. I'm surprised that hasn't occurred, and it was left to President Sisi and the Egyptian government to try to do that, to their credit, following on what had been an IGAD summit, some attempts from the AU. So what I see is as much of it's not so much a fragmentation, but a rather fragmentarian, staggered process from the international community, which I think has two fundamental effects. One, it leaves many of the players, and certainly those surrounding, it diminishes the confidence. Everyone's watching each other and over their shoulder instead of being gathered round the table. Two, the parties themselves. This sort of situation creates the conditions for rampant opportunism and utter recklessness. Opportunism within the country and recklessness among those who may think it's useful now to go scavenging in Sudan. Military, economic, whatever kind of scavenging. And this is the real danger we have, because that opportunism risks now, you can't be quite sure where it'll go. You know, is it the Wagner Group? Is it some other country that's financing? Are there other interests who come in, whether it's criminal, whether it's another state and the like? But, you know, I don't want to go into the detail of it right now, but this is the problem that we have. Therefore, what do we do? What can we do? I'd appeal to those who are, if they are going to gather again in Jeddah, to bring everyone to the table. I can assure you, I think everyone would agree with me that if those two countries at the highest levels were to ask all the interested parties outside to come, everyone would. I mean, no doubt about that. And there'd be none of these sort of, you know, forum shopping that would occur. And get the AU, get IGAD, get Chad, Egypt, everyone involved. That's one. Two, it would be a very clear message to the parties. Now, there's been I come at the issue of this, the issue of the presence of any foreign forces, like the East African Standby Force. Here are the issues. We have a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding, and it is a catastrophe. If you talk to the World Food Programme and people like that, they must be itching to come out and use the famine word. IPC 5. There are parts of Sudan which are at that level. Now, that means we've got a whopping problem, with huge logistical implications. This isn't just a small bit of geography. So if you've got a humanitarian crisis, and part of it is an urban one, because Reem has very eloquently described the tragedy. You know, there are 6-7 million people sitting in Khartoum, if I'm right. I mean, what in heaven's name is happening to them? And leave aside the rest of the country. To do that, how do you guarantee access? How do you assure that there's protection to be able to deliver? How does one control airports? I won't go into the details, but this is why, for me, to ensure that there is an ability to bring assistance in, some essential components of a protection force is needed to allow sites to be protected, from which, this is why, for me, it was after April the 15th, I thought, we've now got a Mogadishu situation, but writ large, over huge expanse of territory. Now, who does that now? I don't know. But the fact that one of the belligerents or the other object to someone coming in doesn't hold sway. As far as I'm concerned, they've abdicated their rights to comment on this. I'm not sure who is sovereign, but it's clear there's no one identifiable sovereign entity running the country at the moment. That's our problem, even though someone claims state institutions. Next, if we've got to deal with the humanitarian, then we get to, I think, who negotiates some security arrangement, an agreement for people to separate and the like. I would hope the Jeddah process does that, because I'm not sure that anyone else is in a position to. Is that happening or not? And if not, to what extent is that associated with the humanitarian imperative and the need to protect any humanitarian initiatives? And finally, then that gets us to, well, if we've got that and the belligerents are the ones who are making the deal, this is a case of moral hazard of a high order, because the people who brought the country to its knees are the ones who are apparently delivering a solution. And Reem and Yasir have both referred to this already. Where are the civilians in this? They may be fractured, they may be fragmented, but who is speaking for the wider population? And can either of the two belligerents claim any legitimate right to speak for them? And I think Reem's, makes a very important point in saying there needs to be a way in which the civilians gather fast to find a way to present themselves. Political parties, the unions, all the resistance committees, who, by the way, are the ones who are holding any sense of human solidarity together. I mean, the foreigners aren't present helping. This is being done by Sudanese. We should be recognizing that. it's in that some our political process should be built. Now, from where and who does it? This is where the African Union, the neighbors, Egypt, can all play their role. But someone soon enough needs to start stepping forward to say, we're going to offer a venue where this sort of discussion can occur, while other security discussions are occurring to allow humanitarian work to continue. Let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. This is just what I think was necessary, sort of laying out the broad framework here, whether on the ground, what the communities are doing, what's happening, and of course what the international community is not doing. So very, very helpful, and thank you for that. I have a series of questions. I think for all of you. All of you talked about fragmentation to some degree, and we'll start with that. Ambassador, you talked about more actors on the ground who are filling these spaces, or being opportunistic, and I'm sure Yasir and Reem have something to say about that as well. Are we headed toward a redivision of Sudan? Is this headed to, we're seeing elements of separatism, calls in Port Sudan for federalism. I mean, is this Humpty Dumpty? How are we going to keep this together? Can it remain together? Is there a Sudan? I mean, maybe we can start with Reem on that.
The short answer is I don't think so. I don't think we will have a Sudan soon. I think fragmentation was going to happen anyways, but I think it's happening way too soon. If we want to talk about what is happening right now, and Mr. Ambassador, you talked about what's happening in Niger. For example, the president who's he's probably going to be ousted right now, he's related to Hemedti. This is just a piece of information to show that this is all the different colonial borders that were set up. They don't really reflect what's happening on the ground. They don't really respect or understand the aspirations of the cross-border groups that don't really believe in borders, basically. So, and this is why Hemedti is actively and so easily he's able to recruit from his groups, basically, that are spread out from the Red Sea until the Atlantic coast, basically. So I think yes, I think what's happening right now is there is the map of Anglo-Egyptian Sudan is being challenged, basically, and it's being challenged by different actors, and it's also being challenged by different actors inside and outside Sudan. So what we're seeing right now is we are going to see more more areas that are going to be controlled by the army, more areas are going to be controlled by the RSF. The RSF, they have been trying to basically set up a government in West Darfur. Okay, so right now what I see, we're heading towards a Libya-like situation where you have two states in one state and you have two different governments, and it's going to be very difficult to kind of have this reintegration again. And at some point, I think different regions are going to give up on the idea of Sudan, because it's going to be, they would just want to get out, basically, of this problem, okay? And they don't want the war to reach them. And this could happen in the case of East Sudan, for example, where they could just say, we don't want this war. We don't have any interest in this war, so we just want to be separate, or we want to have some kind of autonomy just so we can protect ourselves and our interests. So definitely, I think the war was really just the last, basically, I would say, the straw that broke the camel's back, basically.
Thanks, Reem. One of the questions that somebody had sent in was asking how different or similar is what's happening in Sudan to what's happening in Libya. So I think we checked that one. Yasir, any comment on this?
Yes, I think fragmentation or a divided Sudan is not that in the scene yet. I think there is a way to keep Sudan as it is now. I think so. For example, when Hemedti actually did his attempt in Khartoum, he wasn't thinking about just getting Darfur and just make his state there. He was thinking about the whole country. And I think that's the whole point, is that the reason that RSF is still fighting in Khartoum, even though they have controlled vast areas in Darfur, is that they want a role in ruling the whole country. So that's, I think, if the army now is controlling the northern region, eastern region, southern region, yes, they're not controlling the capital, but most, I think, if we're talking about sovereignty, I think they represent kind of the remaining state institution. And here where we should look at, in terms of who is gonna, fill the vacuum. I think that, as Reem said, the civilian society is still there, is still active. And I think also Ambassador Alex pointed out the resistance committees, even tribal leaders who they played a huge role in trying to keep this or not develop into a racial war or a tribal war. So I think those could actually play an important role in bringing together the country, and it's also just avoiding any disintegration in the future.
Ambassador, Humpty Dumpty, can you put it back together again? Or I mean, I know we tend to have a predilection for states for not redefining boundaries, et cetera, but how do you see this playing out?
Well, if there isn't some decisive move to bring together people outside to prevent this occurring, meaning all the neighbors, this risks just dragging, and how can I put it? It just spreads. It's a frittering that occurs. And I wouldn't underestimate, don't ever forget that Sudan already lost one chunk legally after a civil war. That's one. So, and this is a region where you have had secessions, and a couple have been successful. Eritrea was that too, Somaliland. This region is a bit different in that sense because of a somewhat different colonial history. But I think secondly, I'd be worried, and I think Reem raised something very important we should be aware of. The sense of allegiance that goes beyond borders, whether it's by tribe or religious affiliation or whatever, is something that in the absence of a state that commands the respect and gives a sense of belonging, in the absence of that, it is entirely natural that these movements acquire some strength. Now, the problem that we're going to face is, because Yasir gives the other perspective, which I think is also valid, is that people, at the end of the day, people are really allergic to the notion of rethinking frontiers. So do we deal with a holding operation, which is kind of a polite cover for a complete failed state, and people pour tons of money into it and all the rest of it? Or is there something that can be done to create rapidly a sense of the restoration of a process that will create some form of legitimacy to government? And who becomes part of that? And that's why I'm a little concerned by, I find much of the diplomacy going on right now, frankly, just downright lackadaisical. Is it just that people in different capitals think that, there are other more important things, that this is just another little war in some distant, faraway place? Because if they do, my goodness, it's going to bite a lot of people in the backside very fast, very, very fast. So I don't have the answer, but someone needs to wake up and shape up fast. And I think we know who it is that need to gather and do this. I do believe, though, a time has come where there's got to be a willingness to show some force and put teeth behind an attempt to bring people around a table. I'm not sure just polite discussions are going to result in, because in the absence of something decisive like that I'm suggesting, I think we're going to see this, as I say, proliferation of weaponized groups and interests. And we'll be still at this in a year's time, but dealing with a mess much worse than what we have now.
Thanks. Yeah, very bleak bleak picture. We've spoken around it, but really haven't named names yet about who the problematic actors are outside of Sudan are here. We've seen reports about Haftar providing weapons. We know that Hemedti, in addition to Niger, has a cousin in Chad, right? Or tribe that are maybe playing a role. The UAE is said to be playing a role. Can we talk a little bit about what states are doing? I mean, I've seen reports, but I don't have a clear understanding about how far this goes. I see Reem shaking her head on this.
I can talk, I think Yasir can talk more about the UAE and so on, but I want to focus, want to go back to what I said earlier about the cross-border groups and so on. Because also, Sudan is connected to Libya, to Chad, to many countries because of the cross-border groups and so on. But what's happening right now is also, like, if you look at the situation, and this is something I refer to in my article about Hemedti, published on CMI, it's about how this group has always looked for a homeland. Okay, so if we talk about the nomadic groups that are basically living in from Darfur to the Atlantic Ocean in different countries, there are minorities in the different countries where they're living, and they are nomadic groups. So they've always been taking up arms because it's the only way to protect themselves and their cattle, basically, which is their only livelihood. And they are not settled, they're not farmers, so they just move from one country to another, and they move across very difficult basically routes, and they are very much looking for a homeland, because if we also look at climate change and desertification and lack of water, and Niger, Chad, so many countries in the Sahel, they don't have the Nile, they don't have a source of water, like an ongoing source of water. So they want somewhere where there's water, and this is what you said earlier, Yasir, that this is why Hemedti is still fighting in Khartoum, right? He controls areas in Kordofan and Darfur, right? Why doesn't he go and kind of try to set up a government there? But there's no water there, right? The Nile and the Red Sea are not in Darfur or Kordofan. So I think that this is also this idea of, like, this is a resource war. We're also talking about groups that need water and that want to be somewhere where they can have a viable livelihood. They don't want to be, moving with their cattle and struggling and facing famine their whole lives, basically, because this has been the situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Yasir. Foreign groups, UAE. What kind of role are they playing? Foreign states.
So yeah, so this role goes back to when Hemedti got like this gold mine, the huge gold mine in Sudan, and this gold business is what you can see in to understand Hemedti's kind of like network regionally. So the gold is being sold in Dubai, and from Dubai to Russia, of course. So you have the Wagner Group, UAE, and Haftar, all interested in what's Hemedti's forces doing. So, and I think this kind of map hasn't been emphasized enough by especially the US policymakers. I think when UAE is not present in Jeddah talks, that's a huge gap. I think even though they sanctioned some companies that are based in Dubai, companies for the RSF, but the banking system is still actually funneling and funding RSF operations. So you have Haftar, also weapons coming from the UAE, coming from Wagner. There was a Wagner base has been attacked by the SAF a couple of days ago, where Wagner's operates were there, like they were there, and also you have also Eritrea, which also has a very strong ties with UAE. So and I wanted to point this because it's very important that the RSF is supposed to be under SAF or under the armed forces, but what we have seen after the war is that the RSF has a very independent foreign relations. Like even in Africa, the political advisor of the RSF visited the Ugandan president weeks ago. He was in the EU kind of meeting about Sudan, even though there is no official kind of there is no official role that he would be invited to. Now he's convening political actors in Togo with the foreign minister of Togo. So you can see how the RSF, with of course the gold operation and the gold business, has developed kind of an international network of to serve in its interest. So without addressing those, without addressing all of these actors, and especially the financial backers of the RSF, I don't think they're gonna sit or talk in any future negotiation.
So as a former diplomat, when I was in government, I used to call out all the countries that were meddling in Libya. Can you add anything to what we're talking about in Sudan here?
Look, I think you can start calling a lot of people out. And what's worrying is that, as that's what I was trying to get at earlier, as this continues, we're going to do an awful lot of name calling, because more and more people are going to start climbing in. What I think is as interesting, not just to watch, but to begin to address, is the way, probably, especially in all the countries that surround Sudan, alliances shift, because everyone at the moment is hedging. That's really what's going on. And no one's stepping in. I'm not saying to tip the scale, though there are people who would suggest that strongly, whether in favor of SAF or RSF. But everyone is hedging. And when they hedge, that's when there's the opportunity time to rethink. You keep the lines open. And I think that's what is worrying to me. All the countries that have been named, yes, they're all involved in one way or another, have been, are, may become more pronounced in their involvement. But I think there's another pattern that I see, which is we have little groupings. For instance, I think the Egypt, Eritrea, that northeastern corner along the Red Sea, I don't know how Saudi Arabia associates with them, given that in effect they're all neighbors. The fact there's a bit of water between them, it makes for neighbors. The fact that South may be more secure in Eastern Sudan, Port Sudan, may be making, as people hedge, a natural sort of grouping which will begin to look at how do you secure, if the worst comes to the worst, this geographical space. And so I'd be looking very much at this. So it's not just meddling. People are beginning to wonder how they best protect themselves from being infected by this collapse. That's one. If you're in Chad, and I'm not an expert, I don't know Chad well enough to comment, but I would be looking at Chad, Libya, Darfur. What's going on there? To what extent is the younger Debbie now trying to work out? Has he shifted? Is he shifting? And, you know, given all the sort of familial and other ties that exist across into Darfur and beyond, that's what we need to be looking at, which is, but I'm not suggesting we spend our time analyzing, but know these things in order to understand what is the pattern and the trend that that needs to be probably arrested if you want to retain a vestige of a unitary entity called Sudan. Otherwise, we're into an informal federalization, would be the nice way of putting it, but Lord knows it probably will be a bunch of protection rackets.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got a few minutes left. And I know, Ambassador, you've talked about this a bit. With the lackadaisical diplomacy, it really points to, I think, a lack of sense of urgency, right? And you've talked a bit about the consequences for this going on, Red Sea, Sahel, etc. Is, we didn't talk about Islamism, very much. But if each of you, and we'll start with Yasir and then go to Reem and then finish up with the ambassador, can you make your case about one more time to restate in your case, Ambassador, but also Yasir and Reem, to restate just why this is so critical, going beyond the humanitarian and the suffering, because it's very hard with so many wars going on in the world to get people energized about this. I think you've laid out a case. I want to hammer it home for people before we get off. So Yasir.
Yes, I would just repeat what I've said, is that it's going to be a regional bomb if international actors, and I would name the US specifically, could not intervene in this with a high level kind of officials. We have seen the US before in Sudan, the US role in negotiating the peace agreement, the comprehensive peace agreement, and the US was engaged. There was a presidential special envoy, which we don't see right now. There is, as I said before, there is this disengagement is gonna come back, and it's gonna hurt the US interest in the region, specifically as Reem mentioned, with those fighters that do not recognize borders. We're gonna see a very bad version of Boko Haram or ISIS just going or brewing in the coming days. So with the Red Sea and the reports of the Red Sea, and also the what's going on in the Sahel and the destabilizing factors like in Niger, in Chad, Libya, I think dealing with Sudan now and with urgency and with top level officials, I think is much needed, and what we hope the US could do today.
Thanks, Reem.
Yeah, so you just said everything I wanted to say. Again, Sudan is too big. Sudan cannot fail. It's going to impact all the Sahel, and it's going to impact all the Horn of Africa, which is already a very fragile region, and you already have all kinds of conflicts happening. It's going to impact North Africa, whether it's Libya and Egypt. So you need a stable Sudan to stabilize the region. I think that also the human cost. You now have hundreds of thousands of people, or even millions, that are refugees or that are displaced. They want to go back home. They have the right to go back and live in their homes. They don't want to be refugees. They don't want to cross seas. They don't want to be in any neighboring countries, in any camps. So I think the world owes them that, that they want to go home and be safe.
Thank you, Reem. Ambassador, last word. What does this look like for the United States, for Europe, if we don't solve this? What's the policy implication? Why do we have to solve this ASAP?
I think the following. We have had a growing problem that starts on the west coast of Africa, in Mauritania, let's say, or Mali, and it's now spreading all the way along. The underbelly of the Sahara is now out of control. It's hit Sudan. I don't know how long Chad can hold. That creates migrants, but it raises an entirely new question of who will lay claim to this land and its populations. If we want to have any vestige of continued respect or feeling for the Westphalian system and whatever states and boundaries there are, we better wake up that there is something occurring, and it's now hit Sudan, where this may collapse in front of us. That will have, let's go to the second, who would then be the ones pushing this? Who are these? Do we know? Because if we don't know, we've got a real problem. It's one thing worse than knowing who your enemy is, not knowing who it is. That's the scary thing, and I think we need to really look at it. I think we've not, whether it's Islamic extremists or whatever, there are people who are extremists, and I think there's the rising level of, the criminalized capture of states is really what's going on, or what remains of states and of territories is the second thing. Is this really what we want to be living with? Third, Sudan concerns me. This is, I mentioned earlier, there's a thing, we use the technical term critical infrastructure. The Nile runs through Sudan. There's some 2 or 3 old dams there. All it needs is for disorder. And Egypt's got one heck of a problem, which it doesn't need, let alone Sudan. Those are the dams which provide the water for people to drink once it's processed and the like. It's huge, the implications. Finally, as I come to the Red Sea itself, I co-chair with Johnny Carson over at USIP, a study group on the Red Sea, and we're preparing a second iteration of a report that we've done. And I think Sudan has brought firmly to the fore, how can we understand a Red Sea, a major maritime route and trade route, on which now Saudi Arabia depends and Egypt depends, with Sudan in trouble and Eritrea next door trying to find out how to handle this, and Ethiopia, which has had its own problems, also trying to work out how to survive and not be infected further by more destabilization. We're talking about 250, 300 million people in this vast territory. I think and let me make a final point, there's a tendency to look at Sudan as though it's just another African issue. Well, I think the discussion of the last hour will have demonstrated it is much, much more than that. Therefore, who is above the Near East or Middle East departments and the Africa departments in the US, since we're talking about the United States, who will take this one on? Because this is occurring on that person's watch, whoever that is. But that person has not made themselves too evident so far. Back to you.
Well, that's Molly Fee. But we can.
No, she's Africa. She's
yeah.
only Africa. In fairness to her.
Yeah. No, that's right. No, this is it's traditionally almost a scene issue for the State Department, but I think we've laid it out here, the consequences of this going on, the spillover, the consequences for other countries like Egypt, potentially also the Red Sea, which is global commerce. So this could have really profound consequences, I think, for all of us, Europe, the United States, in addition to Africa, and of course the people of Sudan. Well, on that uplifting note, I'd really like to thank Reem, Yasir, and Ambassador Rondos for what I think has been really a fascinating, if not depressing, but and highly enlightening panel. So for all the viewers out there, thank you for watching here at the Washington Institute, and have a good day. Let's hope for diplomacy. Thank you very much.